Welcome to Chapter 3. This chapter is focused on eye behaviors. So I'm hoping that you are finding these lectures to be helpful in writing your papers and tailoring the reading for the quizzes. Again, feel free to email me any questions or concerns that you may have. So the chapter opens up with this idea of eyes being the mirror to the soul or the window to the soul, and that we really trust in eye contact and what it represents. And we believe that there are certain eye contact behaviors that demonstrate certain traits. So people that are honest or trustworthy are going to display certain eye gaze, as we'll find out, or eye contact or mutual eye contact behaviors that are going to be different than people that we find to be deceitful or dishonest. So they start off by giving you 14 different types of eye behaviors, and this is on page 55 and 56. I am not going to go through all 14 of these. I just wanted to point out kind of three concerns that you may have if you've already read the entire chapter. The first one is the general term of eye contact. When we think of eye contact, we think of looking someone in the eyes directly. If you've ever heard of that term, that's normally what we're referencing. When they reference eye contact, they're really talking about simply looking at somebody else. They're not necessarily saying it has to be direct eye contact, right? That we're doing eye to eye. When they reference eye gaze, that's what they're really talking about when they're saying direct eye-to-eye contact. And this gets very confusing when they then go on to talk about mutual eye contact. So it's one person gazing into the eyes of another person. Does it necessarily matter all of the different types? I'm pretty sure they kind of meet your expectations and they're very self-explanatory when you're going through them. It's simply important to recognize that as a whole, we use the term eye contact kind of in mainstream society to reference looking someone directly in the eye. In fact, that's what they go on to do in this chapter, even though they call it eye gaze. So if that was a little bit of confusion for any of you, I just wanted to clarify that. If you have questions on the other 11 different types of eye behaviors, feel free to let me know. But I think for the most part, you can handle those definitions. So they do go on to talk about how we measure the different, variables with regard to, they call it gaze, but again, it's eye behaviors. So when the studies are presented to you in this chapter, and they talk about this idea of looking someone in the eyes or maintaining eye contact or sustaining eye contact or averting eye contact, what they're referencing is first the frequency of individual looks. So how often do we look people directly in the eye? Then the total duration of those looks. So for how many seconds are we holding it? I'm sure you've met people that will look at you and look away really quickly, or look down, or look around, or be searching the room for someone else to look at. So that's talking about the duration. They also talk about the proportion of time, which in any given face-to-face interaction, what percentage of time do you spend looking directly into the other person's eyes? Okay. Sometimes that's different depending on if there are multiple people in the interaction. Then they talk about this average duration and standard deviation of the duration, and that really comes down to are our eye gazes or eye contact that we're making with one another short or long? So do I stare at you for a long period? Do I look at you and look away really quickly? And then how many of those are long gazes and how many of those are short gazes? Okay, and that's important to kind of understand the different dynamics or functions that come into play when we're looking at eye contact. The question that was addressed right away in this chapter is this issue of, are we aware of it? Do we notice when people look away from us really quickly or they stare at us intensely? And are we able to pick up on the subtle differences? I'm sure all of you have encountered someone in your life who does not look at you in the eye. And it feels weird, right? It feels awkward or disrespectful. Some people do it oddly. There was a woman I grew up next door, and she would talk to you and maintain a conversation, but she would be looking down the entire time. Imagine if all of these lectures I just stared at my notes the entire time to stay on track. How weird would that be to just be watching my eyelids? And that's what would happen, although that looked more like I was asleep. But I also had a student this previous semester who let me know that he never looked people in the eyes. He just didn't feel comfortable doing so, but he recognized that people reacted poorly to that. So he said to me, week 2, he's like, I don't want you to think I'm being disrespectful. I just don't feel comfortable looking you or anyone else in the eye. So clearly it's kind of a notion or a stereotype in our culture or belief that eye contact is important and it communicates at the very least something positive, right? Maybe a sign of respect, or as we'll soon talk about, this issue of power and dominance. So are you aware of it? Sure, but probably only when it comes to a certain extreme. So the person who never looks at you, or the person who, stares you down the entire date that you're on or interaction that you're having. So the book talks about the 7 different functions of eye behaviors, and this is I'm going to try to stick in chronological order for you if you're going through the textbook at the same time. It starts on page 57 and goes to page 64. The first one that they talk about is that eye behaviors indicate degrees of attentiveness, interest, and arousal. Okay, so they talk about how our pupils dilate when we are actually interested in something. Now, of course, they reference this to sexual arousal. So if all the pitter-patter for somebody, your pupils are going to dilate. But your pupils have also been shown to dilate if you're interested in the topic at hand, or they talk about when they show like gourmet meals or certain desserts that go by, your pupils will actually dilate, and they will constrict as the interest decreases. Okay, so that's a very simple way of kind of using the science of eyes to indicate whether or not we are interested in whatever is going on, right? The context, the person, or the situation. The second function, they talk about how we can use eye contact to influence attitude change and persuasion, which is a huge area of research. In fact, it's one of the chapters we're not going to talk about in this textbook as it relates to politics, so I decided to cut it. But they talk about the power of a persuader. And they talk about this idea of, does it matter as much what the person is saying or how they're saying it? And the research has found that persuaders, or people who are better at persuading people, sustain this eye contact. They lock you in. They pull you in. Is it to make you feel important? To keep you engaged? Right? What does that communicate to us? What they don't do, right, people that are more apt to persuade people, is they don't shift their eyes. They don't do the eye shift around, where kind of like your eyes are dancing. They don't look down or away, okay? And they don't blink excessively, right, or exhibit any type of eye fluttering, which are normally nervous habits, or that's what we tend to associate those type of behaviors with. We believe people when they look us directly in the eye. We think they're honest. We think they know what they're talking about, right? It communicates that idea of, I've got this. I know this. I don't need to look around. I don't need that reassurance, right? I know what I'm talking about, and you should believe me. And that's what that direct eye contact is going to do. So diverting your eye gaze, this idea of kind of looking away or looking around the room, if you're in a social situation, right, it might be that something's going on around you. However, if you're in a job interview and you look away, what they'll tend to think is that you're lying about something. You're kind of searching for an answer. You're deceiving them in some way. So the idea of maintaining eye contact is important. And often students have asked me, well, can you stare too intensely at somebody? Yeah, I'm sure you've met those people that you feel like, they're like burning you as you lean back and they're staring at you so intensely, and it can feel overwhelming, and you don't want to do that. But of course, it comes to the extreme of, how do I know? How do I keep the balance? It's always erring on the side of more eye contact versus less eye contact. You will actually feel your eyes tear up or water up when you are staring too intensely at someone. So that can kind of be a red flag for you if you feel like this is something you need to work on. Okay. The next function is that eye behaviors are going to help you initiate and sustain intimate relationships. You guys all know this. You do the googly eyes at someone, right? Or when you are first going out with someone, you you stare at each other. It's called a mutual gaze, right? You stare deeply into each other's eyes. They've made many, kind of love songs or comedic jokes about this. But there's some truth to that. That we really feel like we're getting to know somebody or maintain that intimate closeness with them when we're looking into their eyes. what we do is do this nonverbal echo. So if I am in a new relationship, or if I'm with, my current boyfriend and we're out to dinner and he's looking at me, say 60% of the time, I will kind of mirror that, right? Just because it's that idea of reciprocal, I do what you do to me back. One of the interesting findings, or a finding I found to be interesting in the textbook in this category, was that they said that men break eye contact more frequently than women do. And I thought this was interesting given the connection that we will soon find with eye contact and dominance, that men would do this. They also found that men who look down more than their partner does, they are actually viewed as less masculine and less interested in some type of sexual encounter. Now, whether that's true or not, but that's going to be the perception of women. So for the gentlemen watching this, or even the ladies, do we make that association? Do we find, because the research isn't necessarily flipped, that men who look down or away from us aren't as interested in us? But that was an interesting finding, because rarely do we see these strong gender lines. The fourth function that eye behaviors play is they regulate interaction as far as conversational exchanges go. And this really comes down to face-to-face, or if this was, like a Skype conversation or a FaceTime conversation, this idea of when we look at people and when we don't look at people in face-to-face interactions. So what they found is that when we start a conversation or begin to talk, we'll look away. And then as we're talking, we will also continue to look away. And then we will give you eye contact back, kind of as an indication that it is now your time to talk, right? Or we want your feedback on something. So we can use our eyes to kind of direct this interchange. They also found that people tend to look at each other longer in the final 2 minutes of a conversation than the first 2 minutes of a conversation. And this could be for a multitude of reasons. They found this in opposite sex interactions, not necessarily dating couples, but could it be a little bit of nervousness at the beginning? Are you timid, not sure, you don't want to come off too strong or too intense? So you go back and forth, and then eventually what you'll end up doing is kind of going through the motions of that nonverbal echo, right? As we were talking about, mirroring what the other person is going to do. So I think that just comes with a little bit of confidence as to why we might not stare or maintain eye contact in the first 2 minutes of a conversation when we would more so in the end. The fifth then function of eye behaviors is that they communicate our emotions, which makes a lot of sense. We talked about this in the last chapter with regard to facial expressions, right? It's written all over your face, a big smile, a pout, right? Disapproval, shame. Eyes can be the same way. Some people, I say they give you these hard looks, or these intense looks, or these hateful glances, and they're doing it with their eyes, right? As they're kind of pulling you in or giving you kind of that, I call it the stink eye, without saying anything and without a true facial expression, they're still able to communicate how they feel about you. They find that our pupils are going to enlarge when we experience positive emotions, kind of goes with the heightened sense of excitement, right? We get excited, we're interested in something, our pupils are then going to dilate. When we have negative emotions, right, our pupils are going to be more likely to contract and kind of pull back, right? Which sounds, again, very dramatic, that our negative emotions are kind of more, hidden, and we literally will pull away or shun away from them. But they have found that to be the case when it comes to our emotional expression. This is just within the eyes, of course. We cannot say that any of these are separate, right? Our facial expressions go along with our eye contact. Next week, we're going to talk about body movement, right? We're going to talk about the power of touch, physical appearance. None of these things exist in isolation, so it's important to be able to recognize that. But it's also important to recognize that you can communicate a message with a wink, right? Or with a stare, or still, again, my favorite, that stink eye, right? Or the mom eye that you can get from people. So understanding that is an important aspect. Now, the sixth function is going to be this idea of power or dominance, which I've alluded to. And that when we perceive people as powerful, we actually believe they look powerful, and not that literal physical appearance sense, but they give that powerful, potent, intense eye contact. And that's a way to communicate your power or to communicate your dominance. Averting your eyes or looking downward, that's seen as a weakness, right, or being submissive. First of all, weakness and submissiveness are not always a negative thing, right? You have to understand the power dynamic that is at play in any relationship, right? You're not going to walk into the CEO of Google and stare him down, right? And be like, I have more power, and exert your power that way. That's probably not going to be seen as a strength. Okay, so people tend to associate this downward look or this averting your eyes as weakness and submissiveness, and that's a bad thing, but recognizing the power play or the power dynamic that may exist between the relational partners. Within this category, they talk about a visual dominance ratio. And what they're referencing is the percentage of time that we spend looking at people while we are talking and then while we are listening. Okay. And they say that the higher our visual dominance ratio is, right, or the more visually dominant we are, is when we spend more time looking at people when we're talking as opposed to looking at people when we're listening. What that may indicate is that we're confident. We know what we're doing. I don't need to look down. I don't need to look around the room. I'm in this interaction. I know my stuff, right? So I am here to communicate. I'm here to play the game. I'm here to talk to you. So that may be a reason why it's important or impactful for when we're speaking to be able to maintain that eye contact. Some people get really intimidated. I'm sure that you, or at least some of you, have been on a date with somebody and you've been talking about your life or trying to get to know them, and they're constantly looking down. And you feel like it feels maybe like a sign of disrespect or weakness or disinterest, right? Because we have those associations, and it could be simply that they're downplaying the power dynamic that may exist if there's a gender difference, right? Or it could be their position in life, because we don't always date people that are equals. So it's important to consider that. The final function of eye behaviors is that they play a central role in impression management. And I'm not going to spend a great deal talking about this because we'll have an entire chapter 9, addressing it. But in the end, the argument is the more direct eye contact we make with people, the better we're going to feel about ourselves, right? The more positive impression that we put out there for people, because culturally, we can't say globally, but across a lot of cultures, this idea of direct eye contact is seen as positive, okay? Whether it's with regard to power, dominance, right, with respect, it's this idea that looking someone in the eye represents something positive, right? Represents that you're honest, represents that you're interested, you're engaged in the conversation, all of these, the positive aspects of it. Although there may be reasons why you are looking away. So, although the research does talk about there are some patterns of behavior with regard to eye contact, such as looking up and looking to the left is a sign of deception because you're searching for an answer, you're constructing an answer, versus looking up and looking to the right where you'd be pulling information from the past. Again, that's a wonderful pattern of behavior. You'll hear it all the time on the news. The book talks about it. But if you happen to notice the date on that, it was 1986. And if you go back to look at the sample size on that, it's less than 200 people that they looked at. In 1986, and that's almost 30 years ago, does that research still exist? And if we've known about it for 30 years, don't you think people would stop looking up and to the left, right? I think we would have picked up on that. Or at least we would have learned from it. So it's important to recognize that, yes, we have patterns of behavior, but in the end, overwhelmingly, there are no absolute truths as to this one way of looking at someone, right? A wink means this, or direct eye contact, holding it for 30 seconds, or holding it for 10 seconds, right? Twinkly eye. I mean, all these things, you can't say that this is 100% going to communicate this message. To some of you, that you may find this frustrating and say, well, that's crap. Why do we continue to study this if we can't say with 100% certainty or even 90% certainty that a certain eye movement or behavior means one thing? I think it's still important to recognize, right, that culturally and socially, there are certain eye behaviors, as I've already said, like direct eye contact, right, that communicates honesty or can communicate dominance. I mean, these are patterns of behavior, even if they're not absolute truths. So please do not forget that. Recognize that there are going to be multiple interpretations for your eye contact at any given moment. So you might go on a date with somebody and the eye contact is, directly reciprocated from one to another, and then you go out on a date with somebody else, weeks later, of course, and that person doesn't look at you in the eye, but you were like, wait a minute, it worked last time, and felt respectful, and it felt good, and we felt like we were getting closer. So it doesn't always mean one thing, as we've noted, and at the same time, people are going to have different interpretations for it. So just recognizing that. Finally, right, or the kind of concluding thought of this chapter is that they really believe we should mirror what other people do, right? Within our own social group, within our own culture, right, or the situation. So if I look you in the eye, you should look me back in the eye. If I'm diverting eye contact, you should do the same, right? Don't give me the creepy stare down, feeling like you're, burning a hole into my forehead, but just kind of reciprocating the norm of what's going on. Okay, specifically, we're referencing eye contact. Okay, so in the end, to kind of conclude with that chapter, your paper topic this week is going to be arguing for whether or not that opening statement, that idea that the eyes are the mirrors to the soul and often reveal the true nature of the self, I want you to either support it or refute it with these 7 different functions that I just talked about. Is that backed up? Is that kind of, hogwash or a little bit, destiny filled or, a little extreme, or is it backed up by science, right? Can we really, and the soul may be an extension if you want to pick apart that word, but can we really see into the truth of somebody, who they really are, how they really feel, what's really going on in their mind by the way they use their eyes? So that is going to be your chapter topic for this week, and I will see you, or you will see me back next week when we talk about body movement. Thanks, and have a great week.